Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Naya Daur. I'm Rabia Mehmood. Today we're here with a very special guest and a very important story, possibly the most important story which is coming out of our region, South Asia, at the moment, which is what's happening in Sri Lanka. The extreme political and economic crisis and instability, and yet a very strong people's resistance movement which is ongoing in the country and has resulted in some significant changes. As we know that Sri Lankan President Gotabya Rajapaksa has now fled the country after months of pressure and people's resistance and protests and marches across the country, but especially in Colombo. And he's fled the country. He fled the country reportedly yesterday, and now the Sri Lanka has an acting president who the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. Prior to Gotabaya Rajapaksa fleeing the country a couple of weeks back, the former PM, his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa, resigned. And as we know that they're from SLPP, and this is the party and this is the family which is also responsible for a wide range of war crimes which were committed during their previous reign, during the Sri Lankan civil war, and when the war was ending, and after the end of in the immediate aftermath of the war as well. Our guest is a very senior human rights researcher, Mirak Raheem, who is primarily based out of Colombo, but he has actively documented human rights abuses and worked towards policy changes across the country in the northern and the eastern parts of the country as well, during the war and after the war as well. And he continues to work. He's also one of the former commissioners of the Office of Missing Persons from 2018 to 2021, which means he worked with two governments. And he is also a former senior researcher with Center for Policy Alternatives, CPA, if I'm not incorrect. And he's worked on not just enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings, those very critical civil and political rights, but also other issues like a range of issues like land rights and other labor related problems in the hit regions of the north and the east as well. So thank you, Mirak, for joining us on a very short notice. Welcome to Naya Daur. I will just start straight away and request you to tell us as to what exactly is happening in the country. We are hearing that there's an emergency which is being declared by Ranil Wickremesinghe, but the protests are still ongoing. Can you give us a quick update also on not just on Colombo, but the rest of the country, which is not part of the news as much?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for having me on the show. And maybe just to say, these are obviously really tumultuous times at the moment, and Sri Lanka, there's so much uncertainty, upheaval, in addition to the economic crisis, just politically what is happening. But also just maybe to step back and say, that it is a really incredible moment, because when Gotabya Rajapaksa became president in November 2019, many of us who worked on human rights and issues of transitional justice, minority rights, there was this sense that that here was a leader who was elected with such an overwhelming majority that we were going to have to live through an administration which would be so problematic on so many issues, not just for 4 years, but 8 years. So in a sense, we are really girding ourselves for a battle which would be many years. So like we set our sights of change in a sense as much longer. And suddenly to be here 3 years hence, to have had this president who was, as I said, came into power with such an overwhelming majority, being sent out of the country, where he's fled the country, like in the dark of night, where he himself, it seems to be from the reports, that he himself was not sure whether he'd be able to get out. That's a tumultuous change. And so in that sense of, for all of us in the region who always view, that changes sometimes seem so impossible, It really has come, even for us, we're still kind of really reeling of whether has he really left or not. So there's still this sense, because at the end of the day, yes, he fled the country, and we all have these images in our heads when you say executive president flees the country. You think of Marcos, you think of Papa Dr. in Haiti, it's all, and President Gilani more recently in Afghanistan. And so, yes, there is that power vacuum, but at the end of the day, he still has not resigned. And there is tremendous confusion about there is an acting president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, where there still is a question about his actual position, obviously whether he can even command a majority in parliament. There's question about curfew, where in the last couple of weeks, Sri Lankans have basically, over the last, particularly during the civil war, been used to curfew as something that happens regularly, and you know exactly what to do. And defying curfew, for particularly say myself, like I'm a child of the war, curfew is something you just take very seriously. But what we saw in the last couple of weeks is absolute defiance of curfew, a continuation of protests, and that's what you're seeing today. Is that for all all the headlines are about it's curfew, emergency, all of that, and instead you're seeing a series of protests. And I've just been getting SMS messages even now of like crowds are marching. Where they're going? Are they going to Parliament now that they have taken over the fourth public building? They took over the presidential secretariat on the 9th of July, in addition to the president's house, the official residence of the president of Sri Lanka. They took over Temple Trees, the official residence of the prime minister. And today they took over the office of the prime minister. So in that sense, and very briefly, they took over the state broadcasting and did broadcast a couple of protesters. And the state TV also went down. So in that sense, there is a seeming complete takeover by what is called the Aragalia, which is a singular word for struggle. And so in that sense, there is this whole sense of uncertainty. What are the next steps? And obviously, like this big bogeyman of this is all anarchy, right? Obviously, it's a time of upheaval, but the question is that sometimes when protests of this nature, which are widespread, and maybe for your viewers, it might make sense for me, as you said, to talk a bit about what's happening in the country, because one would get the sense is all what I'm talking about is very Colombo focused.
Yes, please.
And I just would like to say, obviously, we're in the middle of an economic crisis, which has impacted the lives. I mean, I am, due to privilege, protected and cushioned by my privilege, but it has also meant even just traveling is something you really have to plan for. And I just have not been out of Colombo in weeks. I've been to the south, but not to the north and east in months, for months. So I won't try to kind of like say what is happening there necessarily, but across the country, what you have seen is that it has not just been a Colombo focused protest, like a lot of the major action has been here, as it were, but the main protest site, which is on the golf face, which is by the beach where the president's secretariat is, they set up a protest village called Gotabya, and that was in April, if I'm not mistaken. But what we saw is that a mushrooming of these Gotabya across, particularly the south of the country, in places including Kandy, in Matara, in Badulla, in Anuradhapura. And so in these regional cities we saw and towns, we saw these sit-in protests called Gotabya emerge. And at the same time, what is not often reported in the media is the daily protests, protests organized by farmers, workers, trade unions, etc., where people have come out, and it is really striking, simply because this president came to power with what is called the 6.9 or 690,000 people who voted for him, where he got more than 50% of the vote, 55% of the vote. And so, that is what you have seen, that there is this public protest, and sometimes these public protests take place alongside the endless queues for essential goods like fuel, like gas, like kerosene, diesel. And so it has been a huge season of discontent that has swept through Sri Lanka. Yeah,
Yes, I'm sorry, I have to, because we're short on time, I'm just
yeah,
going to like connect you, ask a connecting question, is that if you can short briefly tell us, although
yeah.
you've given us a sort of view of how the protests are taking place in the south, but and we know, and as you're saying, and Gota Rajapaksa was voted in primarily by the Sinhala voter in the country. But is this inaccurate to call it just singular resistance, and that the resistance is also, although yes, the war affected the areas in the north, and they and east, they have other concerns, and there are a lot of, like, you've been working on that, there are other pending sort of, there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of, how do I call it, there are ongoing grievances, there's not
Mm.
been any accountability and justice, there are those issues. But is this just a singular resistance, or is this also an island wide resistance in the effect that yes, people have are continuously protesting elsewhere as well?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Um, so maybe, yeah, thanks, Rabia, for the question, because in a sense, there are two common misconceptions that, like, so I'll try to tackle both them. One is that there's been a lot of focus on Gotago Gama, which is a protest site where people have sat day in, day out by the presidential secretariat. But really, that protest site was predated by a series of neighborhood protests, primarily across Colombo and its suburbs. And so, in a sense, that one has to, if one wants to understand the struggle, it really is about, it has an epicenter, but it has had other sites where these protests have sometimes daily by the same set of, in small neighborhoods where people have just come out and protested daily against the government and the lack of change, the lack of leadership change. So it is about something wider than just Gota Gogama, that it is also about neighborhoods which have joined there. And there is this sense of, look, it's all essentially in the southern part of the Sinhala dominated areas, and the leadership is mainly Sinhalese. 2 points about that. One is that within the protest sites, when you walk through it, there is like, yes, it is Sinhala based, but it is, you see minority representation very clearly. And because, for instance, there's a large Muslim population in the southern part of the country, there's a huge Tamil population, which is, or whose home is in the south of the country, who have come out. And so even though you tend to hear Sinhalese as the main, the call for protest, you do definitely hear Tamil in there. And it has probably been the first time that, since all the kind of Islamophobic policies of this past government, that Muslims have come out in a way to claim public space and protest. So it has been a really symbolic moment, I think, particularly for the Muslim community, to be able to ally with the Sinhalese communities, and for also the protest movement to say we will not be divided by the politics of racism, which has been fanned by politicians. This is not to say that there's a full acknowledgement in the struggle, in the official kind of the struggle, the Aragalia, about how deep-seated some of these problems are, including about the need for a political solution for the north and east of this country. So that is one of the kind of ongoing debates. And really, even though we might not have seen the kind of mirroring of that same level of protest, at the end of the day, the protest movement against the Rajapaksa administration really, I would say, expressed itself at a kind of a more constant level in the north and east during the previous administration. So, and that was primarily taken up by victims of grievous human rights abuses, particularly the mothers of the disappeared, particularly the land protesters, who some of them are, they're beyond like 2,000 days of protests that they have been carrying out,
For
including under the previous government. Yeah,
for our viewers, can you
yeah,
quickly tell them that mothers of the disappeared are primarily in the north and the east
yeah.
of the country? And can
So
you
the
also tell as to where the land protesters are? And they are
Sure,
Tamil,
yeah.
you know,
The Sure.
and
The phenomena of enforced disappearances is something that has cut across this country and across all ethnic communities, and it has been due to multiple conflicts, including the war in the north and the east, and the southern Marxist insurrection in 1971 and 1988 to 90. But the current wave of protests that we've seen over the last, essentially, I'd say 4.5 years, and prior to that as well, was by largely Tamil mothers from the north and the east of this country. The land protests have been similarly carried out by largely Tamil communities, but there are also similar displaced, and this is largely due to military occupation, where the military has, during the time of the war, they claimed land and have not released it. This includes both public land and private land,
what
including
cities are
buildings, agriculture. Hmm?
what cities are they based in? Like Jaffna and other. Can you
So
tell us?
it's a concentration of military occupation impacts Jaffna, and also probably the most affected by the last phase of the war, Kilinochchi Mullaitivu. But there are also places in particular on the which is in the east coast, Trincomalee, Ampara, and Mana, which is in the north. So there are small pockets of individual, some villages where it's still under military occupation, and where protesters have essentially, in some cases, been able to go and reclaim their land and are sort of surrounded by the military still, and have not been able to get their documents, but they are struggling to reclaim and rebuild their lives after the war, which ended in May 2009. So in that sense of, um, for the north and the east, there is that, I'd say they turn around and probably look at the south, at us, and be like, okay, finally you all are joining the protest movement. While in the south, people are confused and like, why are you not joining the protest movement? And so in that sense of, that's kind of roughly where we stand.
Okay, thank you so much. This was a great primer for our viewers, especially in Pakistan and across South Asia, whoever watches, and a lot of people who are based out of Pakistan but are interested in news from the region. Just one very quick last question, last question. So with regards to the availability of fuel and diesel and gas and cooking gas, we keep seeing, and I was briefly visiting just like last month, and that we saw these long, as you've spoken about the queues, and like and the just the disrupted availability of all these essential items which are linked to the availability of rest of the items. It's What does that look like? Is there fuel in the country at the moment? And or is it just like coming after 2 weeks, 3 weeks? And also, when you have little fuel in Colombo, what does that mean for um, some of the regions you're talking about, which have been protesting against the government for years in the north and the east? Can you quickly just give us, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, a phrase that is off news at this moment is Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis, and we have never seen queues like this. Like, so for me, I have never, I had, I was ill, and then I stepped out, and I was like, the queue is triple the size that it was before, like a week before, and that's how fast the queues are growing, and they just each week seems to it gets worse. At the same time, whenever, frankly, I hear the phrase, I just like, I keep on thinking of all these people in the north and the east. And once I had a three-wheel driver who was with dark humors laughing back, and he was saying, yeah, milk powder is really expensive, but you should have like seen what prices were like in April 2009 in the Vanni, when that was the area that was closed off, and the basically the LTT had held hostage, and the government's firing held these people hostage, and prices were through the roof. So it's good to remind ourselves in Sri Lanka about, in some parts of the country, even though we are having power cuts, they've not had power for years. So it's important for us to always keep that in context when we say it's the worst it's been. No, it's not the worst it's been. It's just been the worst for some of us in the South, right? Having said that, that like at a national level, if we are in a serious crisis, we're in a serious crisis, not just in terms of the lack of um, foreign currency for an economy that is so reliant on exported goods, including basic essential supplies. And this was not just, it would be easy to say this is an impact of COVID, this is an impact of the Easter Day violence, which resulted in obviously death of over 350 people, but also resulted in the complete collapse of the economy. But what it has meant is it's the failure of a political leadership, and that's why for protesters we are, and I'm also in one of the protesters involved in just protesting, whether at neighborhood or at Kotagama, is that you can't divorce the political from the economic. And so any solution has to resolve fundamentally political questions about leadership and capacity and responsibility and accountability, because that is the only way forward, because these economic problems have resulted of problematic and failed political leadership. And so we are not going to get out of this crisis by just finding an effective economist, but we have to fundamentally deal with our political problems as well, and that the two can no longer be divorced, and that they have to be dealt with together.
Thank you. Mirak, thank you so much for explaining the situation to us really well. We really appreciate it, and good luck to you and the rest of the protesters across the country.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.